Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
And my friend, the most beautiful man in the world, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover
wait.
and explore what it means to be truly known.
Right. And to talk about your wardrobe. Because I love that shirt. Even though I'm color deficient, it looks black and white to me. You said it's navy. So when I wish I could see it more clearly, because I can imagine that would just be a gorgeous shirt. With navy and light blue.
It's
cool.
It's a wonderful shirt, and I'm sure the people that are listening to the podcast are thrilled to hear about it. But you can see it if you go to our YouTube channel.
Right. Well,
subscribe while you're there.
That's
right.
That's what I'm getting at. I want people to go to the YouTube channel and subscribe.
Exactly.
All right.
So we are here. This is our last episode of season 4. We typically do a season-ending wrap episode, and where we kind of cover all the things. And we decided to try something a little different this time, and that was to get your questions, to hear what kind of things you were thinking about, you being our listeners, what kind of things you were thinking about, and maybe some questions that were left unanswered for you. And so we're going to dig into some of those questions today, and excited to do that. So question number 1. Is Curt as cute in person as he is in the YouTube channel?
I thought, oh my gosh.
And the answer is a decidedly yes. Curt is, he goes sometimes by Cute Curt. CC, we call him.
Oh.
And to answer your question, thank you for asking that. We really appreciate it, because it's an important one.
I thought the question was going to be, is he as cute in person as he is when I'm just like listening to him? Because like, I mean, I wouldn't have to do much to be cuter, but I could have to do much, because just, if you're just listening to me.
Keep going.
No, I'm just going to stop. I'm just going to.
Okay. So seriously, let's jump in here a little bit.
Okay.
So, first question is, listener says, I would love to hear more about how trauma impacts our relationship with God and plays out in an inability to trust and or attach to God.
Well, one of the things that I think we mentioned in our season is that trauma doesn't just shatter our sense of our stories. It also mucks around with, it also shatters the mechanism by which we perceive what has happened to us. So it's kind of like if I'm looking at looking through a lens, like a camera lens, if I'm looking at a landscape where I'm seeing a traumatic scene, that's one thing. But if the lens itself has been shattered, even the very viewfinder through which I'm seeing the traumatic scene itself distorts things. And from a brain standpoint, this is, again, another reason why we need the help of others. I don't just need like mechanics. I don't just need EMDR. I don't just need brain spotting. I don't just need, I need the presence of others who can see things for me in ways that I can't see. And God is dealing with the same brains that everybody else is. And if I have an experience that shatters my sense of safety in a context of intimacy, because of what happened perhaps in my family, or what happened, and especially if these kinds of traumatic events take place in any way, shape, or form related to more explicitly connected faith-based encounters, if it happens in the church, if it happens at the hands of a person who's behaving badly in that context, or even when people like misappropriate their offices, they might not be, for instance, it might not be a case of being somebody being sexually abused, for instance, by an elder or a pastor or a priest, but someone who's in that position who does not understand trauma, who's not, as we would say, trauma informed, and they're just talking to people, and they present, they do their work in such a way that they expect people to be able to respond to what they would call the gospel just because of what they're telling them, as opposed to being able to be really familiar with what's behind that. And in that way, we are left to somehow cope with the image of God that gets necessarily created in that context. And so at the same time that I long to be loved by God, it's really difficult for me to actually, in my body would have a hard time actually responding to this. So I've been in situations where where a person, I know a person, a colleague and friend of mine who's really helped to facilitate some of this work in their home church, and but there have been other people in the church congregation that have been made uncomfortable by this process of developing a confessional community in which people are actually telling their stories more truly. And this person's discomfort led them then to go to the pastors, go to the elders, and complain about this person, what this person's work is unbiblical. And this would be this would be an example of a way in which, through misunderstanding, people are leveraging power through the church, and as a way to continue to reinforce the trauma that a person has experienced by attacking the very thing that they're doing to bring people into a space of healing that the gospel is trying to facilitate. So it all gets very, very tangled up. And so who wouldn't have some confusion about God in this regard? And this is why it's crucial for two things to happen. It's crucial that we have access to faithful relationships. And by faithful, I don't just mean people who will stay the course, who will stay in the room, but people who are also faithful to the gospel, faithful to the stories, faithful to the texts that we're reading, because it becomes very easy for many of us to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? I don't want to have anything to do with the Bible, with God, with the church, because it feels too dangerous. This is, though, I would say, this is where, again, why I am so grateful for the work of neuroscience in these last 20 years. The work, why it feels like that we are having this podcast, that we are talking about these things. The work that we're doing is specifically for those folks for whom, like, their felt sense of their relationship with God has been shattered. To whom I want to say to you, as hard as it feels, I want to say, like, first of all, like, I get it. This is in my office every day.
Right.
I get it. And I also want to say I am extraordinarily hopeful for how God has provided ways for us to reimagine, even in the face of trauma, reimagine the stories of the gospel. Because we actually see what Jesus is doing and how what Jesus did and what Paul writes about is actually in concert with what we see that the neuroscience is teaching us that God wants to do in the world.
Yeah. When I saw this question, what it made me think of was, a lot of the ways that we experience God is through each other.
Yep.
And a lot of the trauma that happens to us is in relationship.
Right.
And so naturally, it would be confusing.
Absolutely.
Cause confusion. But I love the image of the shattered lens. I think it's such a great description. And I love that this work is about the gauze that fills in those cracks and clears up that lens.
Yeah.
That's
great.
great.
in our last episode, we talked about the woman with the bleeding dyscrasia, right? And she would be an example of someone who, like, she's got an acute problem, but in some respects, like, she would be a person who would, like, I don't really want to have anything to do with the church, right? She had suffered at the hands of many physicians. And in their day, physicians would have been deeply related to the community, deeply related to the synagogue, deeply related to, the religious family. And one can imagine her saying, like, I want to be relieved of my symptoms, but I don't want to have anything to do with the faith community. To which I would say, like, yeah, I get that. I really get that. I want to validate that your trauma and your grief, validate. And Jesus does not let her off the hook. Jesus, in some respects, and this is where I've used this language, and I had one person be curious with me about why I'm using this language. And when I say Jesus places demands on us, God is a God who demands things of us. And of course, this can feel kind of traumatizing in itself, this whole notion that anybody because demanding. And the reality is that if you're a really good coach, if you're a really good piano teacher, if you're a really good director, you're going to come with expectations, with demands. Now, I realize I can use that word and it can feel harsh, but there is this expectant demand. Jesus was not satisfied for this woman's bleeding just to stop. Jesus wanted full reinstitution. And this is why he's coming for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so another question. This question is about how trauma can cause amnesia, and she's wanting to understand why with big emotions is there sort of like she forgets about these things. She talks about a lot of her husband was cheating on her and all these different things that she's blocked out these memories, and she wants to know why trauma causes that amnesia.
Well, I think it's important. There's a couple of parts. There's two parts to the answer. One part has to do with the fact that just the way that we humans engage overwhelming, painful emotion. In order for us to survive the world, often there will be things that we will do to not pay attention to pain. So a simple example, and this happens not uncommonly in situations that are not necessarily traumatic. Like you're playing in an athletic event and you have an injury, right? You twist your ankle and it's bad enough that it really, really smarts, but you're not leaving the game. And you go to the sideline, you get your ankle taped, you get back in the game, and you play the rest of the game, and you play hard, and you play well, and you're not paying attention to this because something else, you really want to be in the game. And the next morning you wake up and you can't walk.
Right.
It's so painful. It's just an example of how able we are to choose to not pay attention to painful things in order for us to be where we want to be. Now, when it comes to emotional pain, sometimes the pain is so great that my attention shifts away from the pain, not just because I want to go someplace where I want to be, but I just want to be away from the pain. The pain is too much.
Yeah. Now,
when it comes to the ankle injury, I go to bed, I wake up, my body is not going to let me forget this. This is going to happen. When it comes to emotionally painful things, a similar thing can happen in that we can, for days, weeks, months, years, decades, practice not paying attention to things. But that does not mean that we are not feeling it. It does not mean that our bodies are not encoding it. Our bodies are not holding on to it. An example of this I write about in Anatomy of the Soul. I write about this story of a woman who, she was out for a run. She was sexually assaulted on her run. She kind of came to, if you will, when she got back to her apartment, and she didn't, the details of what had happened over the last 3 hours were kind of fuzzy to her. She didn't really remember all that. She just was aware that she was bruised and scratched up, and she knew something had happened. She couldn't really quite take it in. Eventually went to get help, ended up in our office, and we started to work with her. And she still didn't have clear memory of the event, but she did know that anytime she got close to that area where she had been running, if she ever went back there, she would find herself suddenly becoming overwhelmed with panic, despite the fact that she couldn't really exactly remember the explicit details of the events. This highlights then the difference between what we call explicit and implicit memory tracks. And in order for me to remember things on purpose, explicitly, especially what we would call time travel memory, like I remember what I had for breakfast this morning. I remember that we went on vacation to the beach last summer. I actually have to pay attention to it on purpose, and I pay attention to things that are emotionally salient. So my attention is drawn to things that have emotional significance to me. They might be frightening, they might be joyful, but I'm drawn to the things that have significance. But if the significance is too painfully overwhelming, and I then don't pay attention to it because it is too overwhelming, if I don't pay attention to it, I literally don't encode it explicitly. But it doesn't mean that I'm not encoding it implicitly. And so I might not remember all the things that happened to me, but I can then have these things, I can have symptoms starting to be evoked in me when I, years later, when I am starting to have encounters with certain situations that actually are reminiscent of those events. So it's not uncommon for someone to have had history of sexual abuse as a child, as a young person, as a young teenager, kind of bury that, and then they get married. And in the course of their marriage, in the course of intimacy, not just sexual intimacy, but in the course of just even emotional intimacy, it gets close to those neural networks that represent the terror of the abuse. And so this person can start to have feelings that they remember, they don't know where they're coming from. And we might not remember this. What's really important for us to recognize, number one, one of the good news, and in a couple of episodes back, Babette Rothschild, we gave about a trauma healing manual as a resource, and just to recognize that in order for us to heal from our trauma, we don't actually have to be able to remember all the details of all the events. We don't have to be able to do that. If we are able to do it, and to the degree that we can, through different ways that we can explore that, through EMDR, through brain spotting, a number of different ways that we can access these things over time. We can, through the help of a therapist, we can bring these things into greater places of integration. But hopefully that answers the question about like why this happens, right. Both from a neural memory standpoint, but also just from a functional standpoint of why it's so hard for us to tolerate these emotional distresses. And the big thing about community, Pepper, is that not unlike, when we talked about Emily's story in our last episode, this notion that when she was in the confessional community and she put her hand on her chest, but then so did everybody else. What we were trying to help her do, what I was trying to help her do in that moment, I was trying to help her actually simply regulate her own distress. Mm-hmm. And if that had been just she and me in a room, just the two of us individually, she would not have had the opportunity to witness everybody else doing this. But everybody else doing this actually enhanced her own capacity to regulate her distress. And this is why the presence of community enables us to hold our distresses much more effectively, so that we can do the work that we have to do to gradually gain traction, to gradually build resilience, to gradually learn how I can be in the presence of these distressing emotions and be okay. Like any other learned thing that we're doing that's hard to do, that's again the beauty of community in these moments.
Yeah. That was a great example in the last episode, Emily's story. And I loved how you went on to say that the other people in the room were finding their own healings and emotions in that moment as they were experiencing that together. And that's been a common thread. And I think it's a common thread throughout your teaching, and it's been a common thread throughout the podcast, how, when we come together in these confessional communities, the person that is telling their story is not the only one that's benefiting. Mm-hmm. It's the person that's listening to the story.
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's been a beautiful thing to sort of learn and understand.
Yeah, there is that sense in which in these communities, like when you're telling your story, if I'm attuned,
Right.
invariably you are telling a part of my story. And the thing is, that part there is necessarily going to be a part of my story that I can't know unless you tell it.
Yeah.
I need you to help me be aware of me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, interestingly enough, is like this. This is the way it is from the beginning, right? A newborn is only going to survive, let alone flourish, to the degree that someone is coming, like to find her, someone coming to find him.
Yeah. Yeah. So from episode 9, we have a question about uh, as someone who's trying to educate the church about trauma, what would you recommend needs to be covered? I mean, everything, you know,
Mm-hmm.
not just with the church, but if you're trying to educate people about trauma, obviously the first thing you want to do is get educated yourself. And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. Well, Pepper, I think it's a funny thing. Um, the very thing that we all most desperately long for is also the very thing that is most terrifying for us, and that is this experience of being known simultaneously. You can't get away from it, right? If you were to ask most people, even people who are not Christians, what do you think of Jesus? There would be few. I don't think there'd be very many people who would say, "Well, I think that guy's a rascal." You know, I would. I wouldn't let that guy. I wouldn't let that guy in my house. I don't know a lot of people who would say that, right? But for a guy who, on the surface, looks to be so beautiful, for us to kill him means, like, for one who is coming to love me, and my response is to kill him, which is essentially what I did. Like, that tells me something about me. That tells me something about the degree to which I both desperately long. I long for the thing most desperately I'm also most terrified of. And so when it comes to the church and educating the church about trauma, it is important to know that the thing in this case, I mean, in some respects, the gospel, Jesus coming, is the very thing that we're trying to do. Jesus comes to the world and says, y'all are traumatized. Y'all have and I'm here to show you the way into, through, and out the other side of your trauma. That's what Jesus is here to do. I'm not just going to show you the way, like I'm taking you. But I can't force you to go with me. I won't force you to go with me. And you have to, at the very least, you have to be willing to acknowledge that you're a traumatized group of people. You're a traumatized individual. And it's going to require certain exacting work for the healing and the recommissioning to take place. I realize I'm not being very direct with this. I mean, I would say, number one, recognize that this is hard to do, and Jesus knows exactly what this feels like. This is really hard. Number one. Number two, if you're serious, to the degree that you're serious about it, it is going to be it's going to be helpful, I think, to nudge your way into the conversation. That's how I would invite you to consider it. So, like, to be curious with people about what they think, what would they like to hand them things to read that are not going to be too quickly provocative at first, but that can eventually, have them listen to this podcast series. I would also invite them to the people who are trying to do this. I would say I want you not to do this by yourself. For us to think as an individual that I'm going to go to my church. It's going to be important for us to go to our church. So it's going to be important for us to have allies, for us to have our own community that is going to help us do this. I think it's important to recognize as well that it is more difficult. It's not impossible. It's more difficult for a church to explore this and pursue this if the leadership does not buy the idea. I know of a handful of churches I'm familiar with where the pastors are just getting after it. The pastors in their own personal work, their own
Right.
personal lives, these men and women are doing the hard work themselves. And so they become reliable witnesses to their congregation about how your life can be transformed when you decide that you're going to do this work. And it will also mean necessarily that you're gonna have detractors. You're going to have people who are going to resist this. And we find this happens in our confessional communities. This has happened before, where we start a group and a group forms and a group starts to do work together, and there will be at some point in time, out of the blue, one of the members just leaves, and they don't announce that they're leaving. They just leave. They don't contact us again. They don't come back. It's just crickets. Because at some point, something about their story was touched in that community, and they can't tolerate it. And we say, now, this is going to sound harsh, but the difference between Peter and Judas was not their acts of betrayal. They both betrayed Jesus severely. The difference was what they did in response to their awareness of what they did. Judas couldn't tolerate himself.
Right.
And for some reason didn't imagine, right? Because we even see that Judas goes back, he throws, he gets rid of the 30 pieces of silver, right? There's this sense he's having second thoughts. There's this sense, but somehow it did not occur to him, it did not come to his mind that Jesus would come for him. He couldn't tolerate himself. It's not just that he couldn't tolerate what he did. He couldn't tolerate what it was like for him to contend with that. And we occasionally have this happen. And sometimes it's what happens, en masse, that a church will say, no, we're not doing that. I know I have an acquaintance, a friend of mine, who's a young pastor who's in a large church where he holds a significant position, and in which he has for now many months come to the senior leadership. He's like an associate pastor at this very, very large church, and he's come to the senior leadership because he's working with a group in his church. They're working through these kinds of things. They're doing the work of spiritual formation. They're doing the work of what we might do in a confessional community, and it's transforming lives left and right. And he wants to come to the senior leadership, and repeatedly he says to me, they just say, that's not what we do here. That's not what we do here. And I said to him, I'm not in the business of telling people what to do. Psychiatrists are kind of loath to do that. I said, but I'm going to tell you that, you're the kind of guy who would stick around in a system like that because you care about the people that you're taking care of. And you're just going to stay the course and stay the course and stay the course until the system chews you up and spits you out. And 5-10 years from now, when you've had enough, you're not just going to leave ministry, you're going to leave the church because you're going to be done with everything. You're just going to be done. And I said, I don't want that to be who you are. And I said, I'd give you 6 months. And if you don't see anybody willing to change in 6 months, and this is me, right? I said, look, I'm not telling you what to do. This is not the Holy Spirit talking to you. I never speak for God. Ooh. I said, if this isn't any different in 6 months, I want you looking for another job.
Do you have any theories on why they would take that stance in the first place?
Why the leadership would?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do think Pepper. I mean, we can use all kinds of metaphors. It's kind of like, I invite you to come into my house, and I love having you in my house. And you come into my foyer, and then you come into my living room, and you come into my kitchen, my family room, and you're going to stay overnight. So I've got a guest room for you, and that's great. And you can even see where I sleep and where the office is, and so forth and so on. But I got 2 or 3 rooms in my house that hold stuff in them that are so bad that I don't even go to see those rooms anymore. In fact, they've been put away and shut up for so long, I don't even remember that those rooms are in the house. And you become so comfortable being with me in my house that, one day you're like, hey, I was going to go down and lift in the basement, right? You're going to go down because we go down and lift. And like, where we're down there, like you notice another room and you just say, hey, what's in here? And you open the door and you're like, what's that?
Yeah.
And whatever is in that room for you, you're like, you love me. You're like, you're in my house. You're like, what is that, man? That looks like, and I'm like, get out of my house. Because the reason that I haven't looked in the room, the reason that I don't even remember that the room is there is because it's so painful for me. And the moment that you touch it, the moment you say, hey, what's here? The moment Jesus says to the rich young ruler who was earnest, the moment that Jesus says to him, basically, like, look, you're asking the wrong question. You're just wanting to know, like, what can you do? And I'm saying, like you can't do anything. And in fact, all your wealth in and of itself isn't so much the problem as it's like exemplary of the fact that you're committed to working your way to get me to love you. And like, that's not kind of how it's working. I want you to stop that and just get rid of your wealth and come follow me. And like, no, like you've got this earnest guy who's coming after you and like, no, I can't do this. And so my sense is that at some point, the very notion of this formation and so forth and so on, it destabilizes a leader's clear sense of this is what we're doing, because a large part of what the leader is doing is not so much about the transformation of hearts and minds and souls as much as it is about now maintaining a particular structure, whether it's internal or external, like their own emotional structure. They're maintaining that by virtue of maintaining the external structure of whatever it is that we're doing programmatically here at the church. And the bigger the system, the bigger the church, the more work and effort that we're putting into maintaining the direction and structure of the church, you can know for a fact the bigger the forces are internally for that person that they're feeling like they're having to contain. I have a good friend a friend of mine who's a pastor at a church who was early in his career with this church. The church was just growing. And a brand new building project had been put in place and so forth and so on. And he had gotten to a point where he was a little burned out. And he took a month sabbatical, went and spent time with a spiritual director in which everything got transformed. And at the end of his month away, it's kind of like his eyes got open and he said, like, gosh, I became aware that we've been all about scaling. We've been all about numbers. We've been all about buildings. We've been all about, and as if that is like that is a signal that the gospel is expanding just because we have more people and more buildings and more this and more that. And he said, like, but people's inner lives, like who are they actually becoming? Like that wasn't a question that we were asking, and that's the question that we had to really. And so he comes back from his sabbatical, his month-long sabbatical, and he told this story to me. He said, I came back and I was sure, because I was going to come back and have a meeting with my elders, I was sure that I'd be out of a job, because I was going to come back and say, folks, if I'm going to continue to be the pastor, this is where we have to go. And he said, to my shocking surprise, every single elder was on board. And as they started to move in this direction, of course, the attendance shrank by nearly half. And at the same time, over the period of the next 2 to 3 years, it gradually started to repopulate, but the handful of people who were responsible for most of the money that was going into this new building project, like they left.
Right.
this pastor started to get wind that people were going now to other churches in the city where he lived, and other preachers were talking about him and about the heresy that he was bringing to the church. But I had the opportunity to be at that church several years ago, and I got to tell you, man, these are folks who are getting after it. And these are folks who were following, Jesus' model that was not one that scaled things. It was not one we're going to do big, we're big and bad and fast and furious. We're going to do the slow, durable, faithful work of God, because God has a timetable, and he's serious about making sure that he does his work thoroughly. That's way off the ranch from where we started this conversation.
Right. It's good though. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we had quite a few questions about our episode on generational trauma, and I think they really kind of boiled down to two different questions, and one of them was along the lines of what if a parent has already physically passed down their genes to their children, and then they discover they have this trauma? What can parents do to find mental healing later in life to help their almost grown children, since their genes have already been passed down to them? That's kind of one of the questions. And then the other one is, if I don't have a memory of my parents telling me these stories, or I don't have a relationship with my grandparents anymore, how do I make sense of my own story without that information? Those were kind of like the two main questions that came out of this episode.
Right. I think for the first question, the really good news is that as we discover more and more that is true about our lives, whatever those things are, as we turn to work through those things ourselves, I think about even my own life, like I don't think, like I could have 30 years ago, I could have given you facts about my family of origin and what it was like growing up in my house. But I couldn't have told you the impact that had on my life at that time, because I wouldn't have known the significance of it. I could have told you, like you said, well, tell me about your dad. And I can tell you things about my dad, that he was loving, kind, affectionate, so forth and so on. That's what I would have told you, that he was just and exacting and so forth, but, loved God and loved me and so forth. And I wouldn't have mentioned that he was a guy who could get angry. And if he got angry, like, you didn't want to mess around with him. Now, my brothers were in the room. They could say, well, what about like when he would get angry? Like, oh yeah, I could be aware of that. And I could name that as a fact, but I would not know it in terms of its full impact on me, which was, it was also equally true that I was learning to be afraid of anger, which meant I wouldn't name anger in my marriage. I wouldn't know what to do with anger when it came up with my kids. I wouldn't know what to do when it came up with other people, with my friends. Like I'm just going to swallow this. I don't know that I'm doing this. In this sense, there's a certain way in which trauma has happened, but like I don't know it fully, like I've come to know it in the last 7 years. When I discover it now, I can say to my kids, gosh, I want you to know something that I'm learning about my life and how my story is changing, because I'm now starting to deal with anger. And I might even say to my kids, I'm even aware here, and here's a couple of examples. I'm even aware of how I didn't deal with anger very well with you growing up. And I really want to apologize for this way that I did this or didn't do that. And I want you to know that if there's anything about any of this that you want to talk about, I really want to be I'm at the ready to talk about these things that I'm discovering about my own life that may actually, and probably did, have some impact on your life. And I want you to be whole. And I want us to be connected and okay and well integrated. And so with that in mind, we can be hopeful about the fact that as we discover things about our own lives, it's never too late to work through that and then share what we're working through in appropriate doses, what we're working through, sharing that with our kids. And what was the second thing?
Then the second
Yeah.
question that came out was more about people that never heard the stories from their parents
Mhm.
and don't have access to their grandparents or anything like
Mhm.
that. So how do they make sense out of their own stories when they don't have these resources that they can tap into to find out what happened prior to their being brought into the world?
Right. It is. So here's an example of this. It's probably true for a lot of us. I mean, I would say it's true for me. Like, I didn't hear from my grandmother that she had been so depressed that she got ECT. She got electroconvulsive therapy when she was. I didn't hear that from her. I heard it from one of my cousins.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hear much detail about that story either. So I don't actually have access. I have only oblique access to the story itself, and only that through my cousin. I don't have it directly with my grandmother. So I just want so in some respects, I have some, but not full access to that. So let me give you another example. So in our last session, we were talking about Emily and her story, and this notion that she had siblings who had a very different experience growing up in the house, and they were not open to talking about her experience.
Right.
And so in that sense, she could have had access to things that she wasn't then able to have access to because they weren't going to grant it, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And so it was not going to be easy for her to make sense of things if she doesn't have access to stuff. And so those are two examples of what I mean to say is, like, our mind often doesn't have access to things that we wish we could have access to, but we still have these experiences. What do we do with these when we don't have the historical data to help us make exact sense of this? I mean, one of the things that we can say is, we do everything we can to gain as much historical perspective as possible. Talk to aunts and uncles, siblings, and so forth. And sometimes those folks aren't available. We can't do that. Fine and good. What we can do is we can be in a community that will continue to help us talk about our experience in such a way that validates that, so that they're saying to us, your experience is not crazy. Your experience is not, if this is happening, as we like to say, with the exception of, some neurophysiologic, serious neurophysiologic problems, like if you have a tumor or if you have an infection or a seizure disorder or head trauma, in the absence of those, the brain is actually a fairly trustworthy organ. And by that, I don't mean that, like, you're going to have experiences that you're going to like. It's like saying when the I may have said this here before, when the smoke detector goes off in the kitchen when I'm cooking bacon, I don't like it. But I don't say that my smoke detector is not working right. I say, like, it's working and I don't like it. When I'm having panic, when I'm having depression, when I'm having these, like, I was like, my brain's not working well. Fair enough. Something's not right in the kitchen. Fair enough. But the smoke detector is doing exactly what it's supposed to do. When I'm having panic, my brain is trying to let me know that something is going on. And as long as there's something going on, it's going to be necessary for me to have somebody else who's in the room who can help me imagine scenarios so that I can make sense of what access I do have, with what little access I do have. This is not a small thing, especially when it comes to people who've been adopted. Right? People who've lived in foster adoption, where they, like many of them, like they don't know who their birth parents are. They don't have access to a lot of things about their life that they don't have. They feel like they're just like coming out of a void completely. And so it's necessary for them to receive a ballast, if you will, a support network that can say, this is really hard. And we may not be able to figure out all the things that happened, but we're not leaving the room. And you can count on the fact that just because you're having this and it doesn't make sense to you, we don't expect you to make sense of it overnight. We're still going to be with you and help validate what your experience is, to continue to help you make sense. And then what are we then going to do with what your experiences are here today? Remember, it has a lot to do with the story that I'm telling ourselves. This is one of the main things, like this whole notion of confessional communities are about helping us tell our stories more truly. And truly isn't just about true according to the facts as they happened in the past. It's also, I want to tell my story truly relative to what is the story that I want to live into. I want to live into a story in which I believe that I'm loved deeply. Now, what if I would like to know that I'm loved deeply by my birth parents and I have no idea who they are? That's going to be, that's going to be like, that's the wolf at my door all the time. And if I can't access that, what am I going to need to do instead? I'm going to need to have plenty of access to people who do love me. In the here and now are going to transfer my story. And this is Mark chapter 3. The people who are in the room, they are going to be my birth parents. They are going to be my brothers and sisters who are coming to love me, practicing this over and over and over again. And we'll continue to say, yep, this is a hard process. This is difficult. This is not easy to do, but we're not leaving the room.
Yeah. Yeah. We have, in our time that we have left, I have a couple more questions. One, we had a listener from season 4, episode 5, who was concerned about a story that you told. It's a sort of a tough story to hear about a family that had some issues of incest that had happened, and then we didn't really talk about what happened to the person that committed these things. We talked more about how the family was surrounded by the church and were taken care of in a place and helped out there. And I think this particular listener thought that that we were saying that this was all kind of shoved under the rug and the church just took care of the situation. And so I just wanted to give you a chance to touch on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks to the listener for bringing this up. Grateful that you brought this to our attention. And a couple of things. One is to this story in particular, as we, absolutely, in fact, the proper authorities were involved in this every step along the way. We didn't talk about that because that wasn't the focus of the attention of the story.
Right.
When these kinds of things occur on my watch as a mandated reporter, this is what we do. We are always involving the proper authorities in this. The proper authorities were involved in this situation as well. It was really mostly talking about, in that instance, we were talking about what the church was doing for the people who had been traumatized.
Right.
So that's that. And so in that instance, it was addressed. It was addressed immediately. Number one. Number two, then to say that we always do address it anytime it's brought to our attention. So I think to just emphasize for anyone the absolute need to involve proper governing authorities in these kinds of situations when they arise. These are not situations that should be left just to the authority of churches or families. When these kinds of things happen, it is proper for judicial authorities, whoever happens to be in your jurisdiction, to be involved, and we're committed to that, and that's what we did in that situation as well.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah.
So then finally, in our episode on sexual trauma, we discussed, mostly sexual trauma that happened to women because the statistics are so overwhelming, right? But we also acknowledge that this can happen to men. And we had several people reach out and talk about if we would be able to share more specifically of men who have gone through sexual trauma and the shame that surrounds that, and if there are any resources or anything like that that you could share to help someone who's gone through that.
Yeah, I mean, we could. It's a great question, Pepper. And again, thanks for those of our listeners who wrote about that. You're right. Most of our attention was in the stories that we told were of that ilk because of the statistics. We could probably have an entire conversation about this particular phenomenon. I think that there are some ways in which when it comes to sexual trauma, there are things that are unique both to what happens to women and what happens to men that have their own particular kinds of brutality in terms of what happens to us neuropsychiatrically in response to this. For men, anthropologically, in terms of like how we tend to be wired in general, I mean, every human being tends to, of course, want to feel like you have agency to protect yourself, agency to move in the world and not be afraid. Again, we could talk forever and a day about this, but men tend to be the aggressors in general. If you look at all the people who start wars, like not a lot of women start wars. Not a lot of women are starting the fights in the kitchen with their husbands. It does happen. It does happen. But we tend to be the aggressors. And so the whole notion, the inbuilt notion that as, you know, a guy who's 6'2" and 185 pounds, I should be able to handle myself in a fight. You know, if you're a young boy and you're playing, and especially if a male is a perpetrator,
right,
it is particularly damaging in a particular way. And the statistics would indicate that those boys that have been sexually abused are statistically more likely to repeat that behavior than the average boy developing as a way to cope with and work out unresolved traumatic experiences. And here's the thing. You know, for most men for whom this happens, it happens usually developmentally at early stages of the game, in the first 2 decades of life. For most men, this is not happening once they're out of their teenage years. For most men, it's happening when they're young boys, or preteens, teenagers perhaps. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that in order for a male to be able to regulate his own aggression, interestingly enough, one of the most important features that helps him regulate his aggression is his also having been deeply affectionately loved. Seen, soothed, safe, secure. The fact that I can be seen by my dad, seen by other men in my life, and drawn in and held and protected, and not just that I'm protected certainly against them, against outside forces, but also demonstrating the value of my inner sense of myself, of feeling needy, of feeling sorrow, of feeling sadness, of my tears as a male being welcomed into the room. When those kinds of things are taking place, I'm far more able to regulate my aggression, because so much of male aggression is my attempt to work out the places where I myself have been wounded and have not had that addressed. And where it can be most powerfully addressed, interestingly enough, I absolutely need the female presence to care for me in that way. But I actually, even more so, need a male presence to validate that to be male and to be broken is not to be something that you're ashamed of. But this is kind of what males live with. We live with this felt sense of there's something wrong with me, and I got to protect myself, from that internal state of affairs. I'm going to burn lots of energy doing that. And when I do that, I end up I keep that, you know, encased. And when I can't do that anymore, I act it out with my own aggression. And so, you know, to those men who've had this experience, I would say, I would love nothing more than what you need is a community of other men and women who are willing to embrace you and say, I want the part of you that has been wounded, that has been traumatized. That's the part that I want to be with in the room. I want that part to not be ashamed. I want that part to be healed. And we need men in our lives in the presence of whom we can reveal these things.
Mm.
But not exclusively men. We need women in our lives for whom we can do this as well. In order for those parts to be regenerated and recommissioned. Because often what happens, this is the beautiful thing that we see, is that when men have their trauma regenerated, they become powerful conduits for healing and regeneration for other men who've had that experience. In terms of, of course, there's all kinds of ways in which men are sexually abused, and we might not necessarily think of it in these terms, but probably the single most ubiquitous, powerful way in which men are sexually abused is through their participation in pornography. Mm. Because pornography is abusive, not just to the women who are involved in this, mostly women. I mean, men too, of course, but mostly women. It's not just that; it is also it's abusive to the men who view it, who participate in it. And so our hope is, my friend Michael John Cusick runs an organization called Restoring the Soul, is in Colorado, that does a lot of work, not least of which he does these men's retreats that I've personally been able to participate in as a shepherd. He will have about 20 shepherds people who are helping him, bring about 30 guys in to do work for a weekend intensive. Many of whom have had, really painful experiences with sexual brokenness, and he would be one resource that I would say is really has been helpful for a lot of people.
Great, thank you, Curt.
Yeah.
So I do really want to take this time too to just thank our listeners, because you had such overwhelming response to when we asked for questions. You really opened up and asked a lot of questions and told some of your personal stories, and we just really appreciate you. We appreciate that you are listening. This is the final episode of season 5. We've traveled through this 12 episodes on trauma.
Season 4.
Season 4. And it feels like 10. Season 4. And
what am I supposed to do? Okay, wait. Okay, you're landing this plane so beautifully, and I probably just I'm like, I don't want him to be confused.
Right. The reason why I said 6, I'll tell you in a second, is because season 5 is coming out on July the 6th.
Talk to me.
So mark your calendars. You would think after 12 episodes of trauma, we would be talking about, laughter and joy, but we are digging into the soul of shame for season 5. And I am really excited about it. Curt Thompson's second book, entitled The Soul of Shame, similarly to the way that we went through the soul of desire in the 3rd season. We're going to go through chapter by chapter the soul of shame, and we are all going to benefit from it, and I can't wait. Curt, thanks for this great season.
Thank you, man.
And we are going to head over to our YouTube channel now to have our post-show conversation with Amy. We've saved a question, a couple of questions, but one of the questions that I'm looking forward to answering is how Curt and I and Amy all became friends, and how we came to know each other. So be sure to check that out as well. Curt, I love you, and we'll be back next season.
Awesome. Right.
Season 4. Oh my gosh. I cannot believe.
I can't either.
What do you love?
Like I said, it feels like 10. So,
what questions do you have?
Yeah, so I think we should answer the question of we had a listener that wanted to know how we all became friends and how we came to know one another. Ladies
what a
first.
Fun question.
Yeah.
Okay, you were about to say ladies first.
More fun.
I was.
I think that makes sense to me, because I think that of the 3 of us, I don't know, she might have been the first to be aware that anything was going to happen that eventually brought us together.
Yes.
Yeah.
I would guess that.
Yeah. So on that wasn't when we first met, but I remember sitting with you, Curt, And I remember we were outside somewhere on a concrete bench, and it might have been Orange County. And I was like, Curt, you've got to do a podcast. And to which you replied, I'm so game. I have no idea how to do that, but I'm so game. And this was years ago.
Yeah.
And then we'd have little conversations here, there. And then I was like, oh my gosh, you got to do co-host with Pepper because that will even be more fabulous. And then, boom, Pepper's like, yeah.
Okay.
So let me answer this. Let me ask this question again.
Am I confused?
How did we start the podcast?
Because you said the three of wait.
Right.
Okay, so go back to
wait.
your...
Okay. Pepper, could you please repeat the question?
Yes. So the question
Let's
was...
start over. Breaks.
Yes. Yeah. So we had a listener that wanted to know how we all became friends and how we first met.
Okay, but then what did you say, Curt? You said you knew that something was going to happen.
I just re-queued you up, and now you blew it again. So now
No, I know, but I want to understand. I want to understand what Curt was saying.
Curt was trying to say...
Well, let Curt tell me what he was
saying.
No.
Because I think
Lean forward. No, lean forward. Somebody.
I was trying to say it's I mean, like, we first met because of Nicole Johnson.
Right.
And you were working for her.
Yeah.
And so I assumed that of the three of us, if there was this thing called Seasons Weekend was going to happen, you would be the first to know about that. Of the three of us.
Yes.
It might.
So at that point, Amy and I had already met. So
I'm going to go first since I'm the lady.
Wait, I just want to clarify. Amy, are we clear about the question?
Now I am. Now I'm clear on the question and on the...
This could be more of a disaster.
So my friend, co-creator, and
who's
boss,
directing? I just want to know who's directing the show. Yeah. Apparently. Well, I don't know because we're just.
So my friend, co-creator, and boss, Nicole Johnson. So I started working with her in 2001, and I lived in Northern Cal, moved to Southern Cal. Stayed at her place for a while until I got my own apartment. And she and Pepper were already working together. Pep was her director. And so I'm at Nicole's. So this is how I met Pepper. So I'm at Nicole's and I had just moved in. I mean, I think I had moved in 24 hours before that. And she lived in an apartment. And Nicole said, would you just go downstairs and get Pepper? And so I'm like... We're going to work all day. We're working at home. So I'm in my sweats and, got my hair pulled up in a banana clip. And I go down in the elevator into the lobby and there stands, who stands there, Curt?
The most beautiful man in the world.
The most beautiful man in the world.
That's right.
And I'm like,
I know it.
Nicole Johnson, you could have just said hey, you might want to brush your hair. I mean, just... So that was my first introduction to Pep, and that's 20-something years ago.
20-something years ago, yeah. Long time.
Wow.
Yeah.
And then what happened next?
Well, okay, wait, go ahead, Curt.
Next thing I know, I write the first book, Anatomy of the Soul, and my agent, Leslie Reed, was working with Women of Faith, that Nicole was working with. And through Leslie, I met Nicole. Nicole got a copy of the book.
Yep.
We had a chance to talk. And she was talking about wanting, she wanted to have a conversation about the possibility of doing something like a spiritual formation weekend that would not be as large as Women of Faith, something a little more intimate. And so it's December of 2010 when the book came out, December 2010. And I'm in California for a conference. I'm in Southern California, and I just happened to, I let her know. She said, "Hey, why don't we have invite some guests over to the house, have you come and talk about the book?"
Right.
And so I come over, I had this, and apparently Pepper was there. But I don't remember meeting him. In that evening. You were.
There were five. There were maybe 5 people there, and I
Oh
was
my
one of them.
gosh! Oh my
He
gosh!
doesn't remember.
That's hilarious. I don't remember Pepper being there either.
Yes,
That's
I
so
was there.
sad.
Were you there?
Okay, so that's when I first met you, Curt, and I was there, but I had volunteered, or maybe no, you don't remember meeting either one of us. Wow.
Oh, I was so nervous.
So
I've never been invited to somebody's house to like talk about my book. I felt like I was 14 in a room full of adults.
well,
You were
I
the
had
only adult in the
volunteered.
room. Then you found out.
Yeah, there are 5 of us. I had volunteered to take somebody who had to leave early, and it wasn't Pepper, to the airport. And there was a lot going on in the background because Nicole has 2 kids. And so I had volunteered for a number of things, and I'm like, shoot, I was so bummed to have to leave. So I met you for a hot second. And
Well,
then
I just want to say I was really bummed that you left too.
Yeah.
So that's
Was
kind
that
of
a
how
bold
I'm sure it
face
was the.
lie
I'm sure
or
I
was
would-
it a
I mean,
broad face lie?
I'm sure I would have been bummed that Pepper would have had to left if I would have known that he was there.
Yes, if you knew
Yes.
either one of us was there.
Yeah, literally, there were maybe 7 people in the room.
Yeah,
Amy and I were 2 of them. He doesn't remember either of us.
right.
Okay,
That tell you all you need to know right there.
So
Okay.
the better question is, when does Curt remember meeting us?
Yeah.
So it would have been April of now my years are getting mixed up. I don't know if it was April of 2011 or April of 2012. So Nicole and I
think
are
it
in this
was 12.
conversation, and she may have been in conversation with you guys when we had our first kind of like gathering at that hotel in Southern
LA.
California when we all came together to have like it's a weekend of like talking. We're processing this, and was that the weekend that I found myself leaning up against? Was it when I couldn't get down the hallway?
I think.
Like
Yeah. No. So my recollection of events were that we were going to do this thing together, and she gathered all these people that I knew a lot of them but didn't know a few of them, Curt being one, to start doing this sort of artistic retreat that we were planning on doing like 4 different times a year through the seasons, right? And somehow Curt and I ended up walking to a meeting alone down this long hallway. I couldn't even tell you what exactly spurred it off, but we just got like so slap happy, silly, like laughing so hard that we couldn't make it down the hall. Like at the end of the hall was the meeting we had to get to, and Kurt's falling down the wall. He's laughing so hard. We had just met, and yeah.
oh my gosh, yeah.
That was a long time ago.
And then so that was kind of like, okay, so we met, and then we would gather like 4 times a year and have these very sort of we're breaking bread together, we're sharing together, and sort of intense, and we're guiding a group of people through various exercises and things for the weekend. And this team of people, the team that was putting on the weekends, got very close with one another over time. And I know that for Curt and I, we just kind of took the chance to be more vulnerable with each other, as far as the people that I hadn't known in the group. And so the relationship just grew very quickly. And then we'd be in connection with each other between these weekends, and then just the longing to see each other again would get more and more intense, just because we just cared about each other so much. And Amy and I had a long history, like she said, like 20 years. Where yeah.
To think our age when we met, I'm like, oh my gosh, that was a long time ago.
It was a long time ago.
I was also struck too, Amy, with in the conversations that we began to have with the amount of internal work you were doing and committed to, and that just immediately drew me to you. And I know we were. I mean, I think I know that we were, all 3 of us were, kind of bilaterally. I mean, with each back and forth, was pretty open with each other about the realities of our life, the things that we were wrestling with, the things that we longed for.
Right.
And I think, and it made a difference, as you mentioned, Pep. It made a difference that we had opportunities to gather as frequently as we did, and it made a difference that there was, we had time, ahead of these weekends. We gathered for a day ahead of time, and every single night we were,
together.
Like we at the end of and it got to the point where, like, after I think the first or second one, we knew that, like, I couldn't leave on Sunday. Like, I had to leave on Monday from wherever we were, because, like, we needed to debrief. We debriefed late into Sunday night.
Yeah.
And so we had opportunities to be with each other beforehand, together, late nights. Every single night we're there.
For sure.
And as much as all of the, the weight of, the I don't want to say heaviness. I mean, like, in a really beautiful
gravitas,
way. Of those weekends, it was matched by the amount of laughter
for sure
that we shared, and it's just like this. I don't know. A meal where you just have the right food matched with the right wine, matched with like something like salty sugar, like what, I don't know where this metaphor is going, but, like, you know what I mean. There's this sense of, like, oh my gosh, I just want to keep tasting that. I don't want that experience of taste to ever go away. And then so after that stopped, I mean, even while we were doing that, even in the middle of this, like, I think it was Amy who said, like, you should do a podcast, and I'm like, I think you're out of your mind. I think, I'm like, what am I going to do this thing? And then when and now, of course, the idea, it was kind of like, it's there, but I'm not doing anything with it because I can't imagine doing it. And then when I wrapped up the manuscript for The Soul of Desire, I don't know why it was. It just kind of popped. Like, I just felt like, oh my gosh, like, now's the time if we were going to do this. And the idea kind of like, it's kind of like, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So I'm finally ready, and the two of you can show up and say, like, yeah, okay, well, now I think we're ready to do what we've been telling you for 8 years that it would be good for us to do.
And none of us ever did it before.
So why not do it?
No.
So let's just jump in. And, we had help from, in the beginning, Noah Needleman helped us with the technical side, and then we decided, we needed to put everything up on YouTube too. So our friend Mark Gould has done all the editing on that. Our Rachel Watkins has set up our website and done a great job with that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Yeah. We have, and Curt, you have some people on your team that are helping as well. Jody and Kara both.
Kara and Jody, right?
Yeah.
Are helping with that.
Yeah. And it takes a village here to do all this, especially when you got 3 blind mice trying to lead the way.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at Being Known Pod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be now.